Whenever I talk to someone about Kiryu the game, I get one of two responses. The first one is, oh yeah,
I love that game a lot.
And the other one is,
Kill la Kill had a game?
Yeah, Kill la Kill had an arena fighter that unfortunately did not live for a long time. But I find its story to be fascinating. A bit sad for sure, because what could have been a great arena fighter and a big reference for the whole genre ended up being a cautionary tale. Now there was a lot that led to Kill la Kill's downfall, but I wanted to hear from the developers themselves what they think happened from their perspective. And none of them replied, so here I am putting all the pieces together. Shoutouts to Puel Sins for the help. This was a big member of the community trying to push things forward, and Iron Foxfire, who made the Kill la Kill restitched mod that rebalances a bunch of the broken stuff. Link to the Kill la Kill Discord down below if you want to try it out. Let's look at these two responses that we had at the start of the video. Response number one, why did people love that game? Long story short, it was trying to push the arena genre forward. It was trying to blend the 3D arena genre with the 2D fighting game genre, and doing it with Arc System Works' name behind them gave them a lot of credibility. This game has a ton of stuff that even nowadays you cannot find in most arena fighters. For instance, something as simple as an anti-air button. Every character has an anti-air, and that immediately changes how this 3D genre is played. There was a lot of combo freedom. Even with just 2 attack buttons, you could create a ton of different routes, almost as to directly counter the argument that arena fighters are one-button mashers. And every character was extremely unique, which is something you don't find in most arena fighters. There's usually a baseline that every character is based off, but in this one, they went as far as creating a bunch of unique meters and gimmicks just for a single character's moveset. Now, the game also had its fair share of what I like to call party game arena fighter BS. I mean, from the very start, it was designed with a rock, paper, scissors mechanic right front and center, but pushing arena fighters in this direction was something that I and a lot of other people would love to see, and we had been looking forward to this for a long time. Also, the visuals were really nice, and the soundtrack is top tier. So that's why people thought the game was good, but what about the second answer? Kill la Kill has a game? Yeah, and the reason why you didn't hear about it is because it failed, and it failed hard. And I think the failure has to do with 3 little things: content, timing, and trust. Let's break it all down. This is a fighting game that launched with a pretty low roster count. The game had 10 characters at launch and promised to release 2 free DLC characters later. And they did. DTR and Mako both came out, they were free, but then that was it. We got a 12 character roster, which is a very low number for an arena fighter. Arena fighters are obviously famous for their huge rosters, but that's of course because this game was designed more like a fighting game and less like an arena fighter. But even as a fighting game, 12 characters is definitely on the low side. Besides the low number of the launch roster, the post-launch support was also very lacking. There were a couple of balanced patches, but every patch was weirder than the one before. And after releasing the Mako DLC, they dropped it completely, meaning the game was left in kind of a broken state. The community was unhappy with the balance changes, and now we had a game that was more broken than it was back at launch. It was also missing some basic features like spectator mode, which made it harder to host community tournaments and keep the game alive from the competitive side. I think the story mode for this game is actually good, but it's very short. It's not gonna hold people's attention for very long, and the other single player modes end up being gimmicks, so you get through them pretty quick. The content was always going to come from the multiplayer, but for that to happen, there needs to be post-launch support, and it simply wasn't there. Now, if the game had a successful launch, maybe the post-launch support would be better, but this game did not come out at an optimal time, so let's talk about the timing. This game came out in July of 2019, and Kill la Kill is a big anime, big enough to carry this game with its own name, except the anime ended in March of 2014. So this is already 5 years after the peak of popularity. According to an IGN article, Trigger and Arc System Works actually met back in 2015, but Arc System Works had all of their fighting game teams super busy, so they didn't take on the project back then. I would say, even if they did though, you start development in 2015, it's gonna be a while. This game is gonna come out too late anyway. Trigger reached out to Arc System again in the next year, and ArcSys, still being super busy, this time partnered with A+ Games to make this happen. So development started in 2016, but just like we said, ArcSys was busy putting out games, and all of these games would become Kill la Kill's competition. I'm talking Dragon Ball FighterZ, BB Tag, Grand Blue Fantasy Versus. FighterZ and BB Tag were on the DLC cycles. Grand Blue was doing some betas back then, but these games would all be alive at the same time and would all be competing with Kill la Kill. And that is competition that exists in addition to the arena fighter competition this game was going to face anyway. I'm talking My Hero 1's Justice 2 and Jump Force. And Jump Force wasn't doing Arena Fighters any favors, was it? So people looked at Kill la Kill and did the same thing they always do. Oh wow, an Arena Fighter. That means a cash grab. Thanks, Jump Force. But to me, the main reason why it failed was definitely the timing of the anime versus the game release. If the success of Kill la Kill could have been foreseen and they could work on a game ahead of time to release it together or a lot closer to the anime, I think it would have done well, even with all the issues it had. But they didn't have that foresight because Trigger is a very new studio to video game licensing, and this impacted development in a big way. Like, you are not ready for the relationship that was Studio Trigger with A+ Games, but more on that later. I think some people also believe COVID affected development. I personally don't. COVID didn't hit hard until March of 2020. Their last DLC was Mako in November 2019. I think they gave up on this game long before COVID became a big problem. And there's also the theory that, wow, Kill la Kill has a lot of naked ladies. Parents aren't going to buy their kids a video game with a lot of naked ladies in the cover. And I'm like, yeah, maybe, but it's hard to know if that was the reason for sure. So let's move on to perhaps the biggest reason why this game failed. Trust. Or at least the lack of trust. The story of this game's development is fascinating, and at the time, IGN made that article about how this happened. I don't think I raised too many red flags back when I read it, but now, knowing how things went, oh boy, the red flags were everywhere. Like I mentioned, Studio Trigger wanted Arc System Works to do this, but Arc Sys was busy and left it to A+. At the time, A+ was already working on a Studio Trigger project, which was Little Witch Academia. That, however, was published by Bandai Namco, and Bandai Namco was an investor in the Little Witch Academia anime, which meant they had much more of a say in the final product. They had a lot more control over what that game was going to become. So A+ Games said that working with Bandai was actually a lot easier than working with Trigger. With Kill la Kill, the anime had already aired 5 years ago. Arc System Works was not an investor in the anime, which means they were only borrowing the license. They had no say in what went into the game. It was all Trigger. And Trigger proved really hard to work with. They called the character designer from the studio the quality monster, saying he likely wouldn't be satisfied unless he drew every single frame himself. You can imagine how much time it would take for a single person to do this, and how much that would delay development. And there was also this quote from the game director. A lot of the feedback, which of course we were thankful for because it improves the quality on one side, but we were very surprised by the level of how granular some of their feedback was and detailed. Now back then I read this and thought, wow, they're really paying attention to all the details. But now I'm reading this and it feels like he's basically saying they constantly told us to fix stuff that doesn't matter. Now to be fair, Kill la Kill is Studio Trigger's flagship product. So they wanted to make sure that this was going to be good because this could ultimately determine the future of Studio Trigger in video games. But while focusing on the small details, I think they lost sight of the big picture, which was you're releasing an arena fighter with only 10 characters 5 years after the anime aired. What were you expecting? And if you're A+ and you just went through all of that to put your game out, do you really want to continue supporting the game long term? Do you really want to keep dealing with Studio Trigger's demands? Or do you just want to put this project behind you and say, nah, never again? Especially given how troubled development seemed. This game that you're seeing right now, this was not the first or second concept that was pitched, but Trigger wasn't down for whatever A+ had in mind. The director said that the first iteration that we had put together, we showed to Studio Trigger and they said, what is this? And they wouldn't even let us in the studio. I don't know about you, but this does not sound like a healthy collaboration to me. At some point, the team even considered a 2D fighting game, but that would have gone way too far over the budget. Confirming something I suspected for a while, just didn't have a source to point to. Fighting games are generally more expensive than arena fighters. It makes sense. That's why we call arena fighters cash grabs. And on top of that, A+ was working on unfamiliar territory. They had never done something like this. The Arc Sys Guilty Gear team drafted a pipeline for development and A+ took it from there. But imagine working on someone else's plan, working on a genre that you don't have a lot of experience with, and constantly having to deal with Studio Trigger's rejection and micromanagement. And I think ultimately it was this lack of trust and experience that led to a split development process and not a lot of confidence in the final product. If you don't have a lot of confidence, you don't invest super hard on advertising, which means the game sells poorly, which means you don't support it long term. But that confidence would have been boosted if only development was smoother, if the game came out with more content, and the timing for release was better. But that is why a really great concept for a game ended up failing terribly and becoming a cautionary tale for other anime games to come. And now that we're all depressed, check out this bad game that sold really well. Why is it bad and why did it sell very well? Because we're all idiots, that's why. Thanks for watching. Bye.